Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at economic and social developments under Stalin and Khrushchev in the years 1945 to 1964. This relates to the AQA syllabus 1H, Tsarist and Communist Russia, from section 4 of the specification. In that we have economic and social developments, changes in industrial organisation from Stalin to Khrushchev, agriculture and a virgin land scheme, social and cultural change from Stalin to Khrushchev. And so in this video, I'm going to cover all of that. This links very heavily with the other videos that I've done on political authority during this period, and also with one of my more recent videos on opposition to Khrushchev. And we'll see that as we get later on, and we see social and cultural change as well as economic change, and why there is resistance to some of that. Overall, we see a kind of thaw in the policies, not as in the Norse god, but a thaw as in a kind of watering down of some of the harshness under Stalin as we get into Khrushchev. So starting off with Stalin, well, Stalin wanted to make the USSR into a world superpower within a decade, and this was his vision in 1956. He wanted to rebuild the Soviet Union after the devastation of war. He wanted to then increase the level of industry to 3 times its pre-war level. There was an overwhelming focus on heavy industry. So essentially, I guess in Stalin's mindset, what had worked in the 1930s in terms of preparing the Soviet Union for World War II was the right thing to do to prepare them for their ongoing rivalry with the imperialist capitalist powers, in particular the USA, in the Cold War that was going to follow. And we see at the cornerstone of this the fourth 5-year plan, which ran from 1946 to 1950. And this involved 85% of investment being devoted to heavy industry and armaments, including the big push for the USSR to build nuclear weapons to rival the USA, mobilizing population beyond the demands of normal working week. For example, workers in Leningrad had to work 30 more hours per month than their regular hours. Students had to contribute 10 hours, and the unemployed 60 hours. So the kind of harshness and kind of force of the Stalinist regime stays very much in place. They continued using prisoners of war, which there was about 2 million as forced labour, and they used the inmates in the gulags, and a population of which had risen to 2.5 million immediately after the war. So they kept on using slave labour. The most inaccessible resource is in the most remote areas. For example, the mining of uranium for the nuclear program was carried out by these inmates. Another key and rather grim part of the fourth 5-year plan was the ruthless plundering of the occupied countries in Eastern Europe, such as Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, from whom materials and industrial plants were taken back to the Soviet Union. Stalin demanded huge reparations from Germany and collected much of this by stripping industrial installations and transferring them back to the USSR. Now, the plan did, through these very, very harsh measures, achieve astonishing results. So steel production rose from 27.3 million tonnes in 1950 from 18.3 million in 1940. So we see a big increase there. Oil production by 1950 was just under 38 million tonnes compared to the 31 million tonnes in 1940. National income was 71% higher in 1950 than it had been in the war. Industrial wages was twice as high in 1950 as they had been before the war. We've got a huge new hydroelectric dam that was back in operation in 47. And in 49, the USSR tested its first atomic bomb. And so a lot of what Stalin had aimed for was coming true. And we can see this very clearly. However, the fourth 5-year plan had significant problems. Yet again, there were shortages of consumer goods such as clothes, shoes, and furniture. With Gosplan, the economy grew bigger and more complex. So Gosplan, which is supposed to be in charge of central planning, finds it more and more difficult to keep things under control and to coordinate all its target setting. Managers tended to aim to meet their targets and no more, rather than increasing productivity and efficiency for their factory. Now, if they did exceed their targets, there were generous bonuses on offer, but that bonus would then come with a big increase in targets for the next year and future years. And so essentially, most managers took the view it wasn't worth the risk and the hassle that it would bring. To increase overall production, new investment had to be of a very high level due to the ineffective use of resources. So they managed to increase the economy, but just by pumping loads of more stuff into it, and we see this with the plunder from the countries in Eastern Europe and Germany. The fifth five-year plan was meant to run from 1951 to 1955. It was pursue similar targets to the fourth five-year plan, but it took longer than expected to devise, and it was only finalized in 52. Stalin's death in 53 then further interrupted this plan. Now, following the death of Stalin, we see the competition for power, and two of the key figures are Malenkov and Khrushchev. Now, Malenkov is in the driving seat. Again, see the videos on political authority in this period. Malenkov favoured a new course, which it would put great emphasis on production of consumer goods at the expense of heavy industry and military production. This ultimately is going to help Khrushchev, who favoured Stalin's original objectives, and this brought him support from the military and those running the big heavy industry. Now, Malenkov actually is looking to solve one of the major issues that we've seen with the Russian economy going quite well through the entire Tsarist and Communist Russia period, actually, this kind of ignoring the needs of the Russian people, the Russian consumers. And Malenkov also wanted to expand investment on housing, services, as well as consumer goods, and reduce the spending on military and heavy industry. Khrushchev adamantly defends him, and through that actually it manages to come into power. But despite his opposition, Khrushchev then actually adopts such a Malenkov proposal, showing that Khrushchev had indeed learned lots from Stalin, who you might well remember did similar things in some of the power struggles that he went through. So Khrushchev also aimed to increase living standards through greater emphasis on production of consumer goods. Investments and resources to achieve this would come from reduction in defense production. The argument behind this was that the USSR now had its own nuclear weapons, and therefore the need for spending on conventional defense was increasingly unnecessary. And Khrushchev had opposed this idea, but now he adopted it. And then we see the introduction of the sixth five-year plan in 1956 to implement these policies. However, the targets set are widely optimistic, and the plan was officially abandoned 2 years later. Now, during the sixth five-year plan, there had been some decentralization of economic control and accountability. 60 Moscow ministries have been closed down, and the USSR was divided up into 105 regions with their own local economic council. This reduced the amount of inefficient and unnecessary bureaucracy in the old centralized command economy. So we are seeing some progress, but essentially this is in part really the story of the power struggle rather than a complete change in economic direction. We then see the really big push for industrial change under Khrushchev, which is the 7-year plan from 59 to 65. So despite his earlier pushes for decentralization, the Soviet economy was still dependent on central planning. A new Supreme Economic Council was established to prepare a new 7-year plan for implementation in 59, in line with Khrushchev's previous priorities from 55. There was more focus on new industry and production of consumer goods. So there was significant expansion in investment in oil, natural gas, and electricity generation expansion of chemical industries, particular focus on production of fertilizers. And here we see Khrushchev connecting industrial and agricultural policy, the doubling in the annual rate of housing construction through the development of prefabricated materials for 5-story apartment blocks, significant development of the railway network, investment to expand air transport and to offer cheap internal passenger flights, and huge investment in the Soviet space program. So they're all the different bits that are in that. As you can see, some of those are going to benefit the Russian people, but not all of them. However, the problems with the Soviet economy essentially refused to go away. So bureaucratic inefficiency continued. Some economic responsibility devolved to the new economic regional councils, was overlapping the central planning of the 7-year plan, so you've got doubling up on that. Decentralization policies were abandoned as they weren't seen to be working in '65, soon after Khrushchev's fall. And the huge investment in the space race and advanced nuclear weapons diverted resources away from areas such as consumer production. So although Khrushchev talks about improving this, we can see the actual figures don't back up really that there was this massive switch to looking at the consumer section of the economy. So the overall growth rate of the Soviet economy in '64 was 7.5%, but the consumer sector alone, if you look at it in isolation, was only at 2%. So this sea change of focus hadn't really fully taken place. There were lots of elements of continuity and change in Soviet industrial policy from '45 to '64. So Khrushchev continued with the idea of centrally directed plans. I mean, we see a bit of variation in their length. So we have continuation of 5-year plans and a shift to a 7-year plan. But they were the main vehicles of implementing economic policy. So the model of centralized planning continued, and it continued to be inefficient, damaged by the level of bureaucracy. Khrushchev's enthusiasm for heavy investment in the space race and USSR's nuclear capability mirrored Stalin's own prioritization of defense. It's a different form of defense spending. It's all linked to the Cold War. And this ultimately comes at the expense of the ordinary citizen standard of living. And we just saw how the consumer section of society didn't grow at the same rate as the economy as a whole. However, there had been some changes made after Stalin's death with the different priorities. So there was some expansion of consumer production after '53, and there had been some attempts to pursue a policy of decentralization in the economy, although ultimately that move doesn't fully succeed. Khrushchev, we're going to see, it was also far more interested in agriculture than Stalin had ever been. And we see this even in industry with key targets for production of tractors and fertilizer. Moving on to agriculture, starting with agriculture under Stalin, 45 to '53. So Soviet agriculture was in a terrible state at the end of the war. We've seen scorched earth policies, etc., the damage by the German invasion, and nearly 100,000 collective farms had essentially stopped functioning. Many peasants had returned to farming the land privately. There was a shortage of labour due to the gigantic wartime losses suffered in the Soviet Union, and many returning soldiers preferred to work in industry, making use of their new skills that they'd learned in the Red Army. So a large amount of arable land had not been cultivated for several years. There was a shortage of tractors, horses, fuel, and seeds. Livestock numbers were worryingly low. So as in the pre-war years, Stalin's priority after '45 was to ensure the supply of grain to the towns and the cities. State procurement of grain took up nearly 70% of the harvest in '46. Soviet peasants again faced with insufficient grain to feed themselves. And we see more horrors in the countryside, with between 1 and 1.5 million peasants dying of starvation. The Ukraine was hit particularly hard. In a further reminder of the 1930s, Stalin ordered a major drive to recollectivize agriculture and reduce the size and number of private plots which had emerged during the war. Again, there's a big problem with this because the private plots proved, as they always did in this period of collective farming, to be far more efficient and produce proportionally far more food than the collective farms themselves. Between 47 and 53, peasants on collective farms were squeezed even further by Stalin's policies. So taxation of private plots was increased. So there'll be, for example, a tax on every fruit tree in a peasant's garden. Currency reform deliberately devalued the savings of the more enterprising peasants that they built up during the war. Again, something that echoes the earlier attacks on the kulaks in the 1930s. Collective farms were not allowed new electricity supplies. These were prioritised for industry, and for the same reason, no new building materials were made available to the collective farms. Average pay for peasants on a collective farm were 1/6 of those of industrial workers. As a result, motivation and productivity on the collective farms was at rock bottom in these years. A lot of, again, the more hard-working individuals or ambitious individuals were going to leave the farms and head off to try and find work in industry. There was some major kind of general policies with ideology and theory at this point. Stalin promoted the ideas of Lysenko, who was a geneticist, and Lysenko believed in the nature of plants could be altered by changes in environment and not just through genetic factors. So he argued that if wheat seeds were subjected to refrigeration, they would grow in colder climates. Stalin sponsored this idea. It was complete nonsense. It was horribly incorrect, and he also sponsored other similarly incorrect policies. And this actually held back the progress of application in science in Soviet agriculture, because these theories were wrong. But if Stalin said they were right, then nobody's really going to challenge it. And those who did, the more competent science, complained that these theories were wrong. They were arrested and imprisoned, again holding back agriculture. There was a reduction in the number of collective farms by nearly two-thirds, and this increased the size of the remaining collectives. Now, this actually improved efficiency and productivity, and it also enabled Stalin to re-strengthen his political power over the countryside, which had been weakened during the war. Unlike Stalin, Khrushchev had great enthusiasm for agriculture, and his kind of key policy was the Virgin Land Scheme. And it was launched in 53. And this scheme aimed to bring under the plough millions of acres of grassland in western Siberia and Kazakhstan, which had not previously been farmed. And Khrushchev promoted this as the solution to the USSR's low agricultural productivity. And there was a relatively small-scale trial in 53, which proved to be highly successful. And so the scheme was massively extended. Over the next 3 years, almost 36 million hectares of land came under cultivation. The Virgin Land Scheme was accompanied by a wave of propaganda, some of which encouraged farmers to move east. One of the main groups involved in the cultivation of virgin lands were the youth wing of the Communist Party. 300,000 members of the Komsomol members travelled east to dig ditches, build roads and fences, and construct the villages there. In addition, hundreds of thousands of students, soldiers and drivers were transported to the Virgin Lands on a seasonal basis to help with the harvest. Initial results were impressive, so something which had helped Khrushchev in the power struggle 53 to 57. The harvest of 56, 125 million tons of grain was a record for the USSR, and over half of that figure came from the Virgin Lands. However, the long-term impact of the scheme was far less positive. Single crop cultivation exhausted the soil, increased the risk of soil erosion, and the worst example of this came in 1960, where millions of tons of topsoil simply blew away. There had been little careful planning, and there were, for example, inadequate facilities to repair farm machinery in the Virgin Lands. There was inadequate transport to get people and goods and then the crops moved the crops away. And the drought of 1963 meant the grain harvest of that year was disastrous and absolutely embarrassingly for the USSR. They had to import grain, including from America. Collective farms and maize under Khrushchev. Well, under collective farms, to improve productivity, state procurement prices were increased, quotas decreased, taxes and restrictions on private plots were reduced. Again, this all looks like good common sense. However, the peasants' enthusiasm for working on collective farms remained really low. Decades of suffering due to Soviet agricultural policies cemented a negative attitude amongst those workers on the collective farm, and this was not likely to change significantly. Furthermore, the constant changes to the prices offered by the state caused resentment and made it difficult for farmers to plan ahead. When we looked at the fall of Khrushchev, one of the key bits that he was accused of was harebrained schemes, and one of these it can be said to be his drive for maize. So, following a visit to the USA, Khrushchev became convinced that maize was a crop which would solve two issues: it would increase the human food supply and meet the need for more fodder for animals. Maize proved successful in the Ukraine, but barely ripened in other areas where it was sown. Of 85 million acres sown with maize, only 1/6 harvest ripe crop. Furthermore, this had the effect of reducing the much-needed grain harvest, as wheat had been replaced by maize in many areas. So Khrushchev, who championed himself as an agricultural expert from a peasant background who could solve these problems, actually in some cases exacerbated or made them worse. Other areas of change in policy was to abolish the MTS stations on collective farms. Peasants had resented these stations for many years for overcharging for hiring out and repairing machinery. They played a political role in keeping control of the peasants for the regime. But the abolition didn't turn out to be a great success as anticipated, because peasants were forced to pay for the machinery too quickly. Also, many of the mechanics from the stations now moved to the towns where they could get higher paid work in industry, meaning the peasants were left with machines they didn't have the expertise to repair when they broke down. There was also a push to get peasants to sell their cows to the collective farms. This policy was aimed at increasing milk production, which was still well below the levels hoped for, but the peasants resented having to sell their private properties to the collective farm, and there was only a limited rise in overall milk production. So again, here we see Khrushchev, the self-styled expert on agriculture, not having an enormous degree of success. There were some changes from Stalin under Khrushchev. So agriculture for Stalin was merely a necessary foundation stone for industrial transformation of the USSR, whilst for Khrushchev, improving agriculture was a key ambition. So was Khrushchev a success? Well, as I've been saying, well, not really. The peasants had been scarred by years of exploitation and careless disregard for their standard of living, and we've seen various periods of mass starvation. It was unlikely that they would suddenly have a positive attitude just because Khrushchev spoke more positively about agriculture and introduced a series of initiatives. Obviously, this is made worse by the fact that some of these initiatives simply don't work, notably the drive for maize. And Khrushchev, to an extent, was his own worst enemy. So his great enthusiasm, for example, on the Virgin Land Scheme, meant that some of his initiatives weren't properly planned. There wasn't careful consideration of local conditions, as shown by the drive for maize, and therefore he was almost overly enthusiastic, didn't plan things properly, and therefore they didn't work. I'm now going to move on to social and cultural change in this period, looking from Stalin first and then on to Khrushchev. So society under Stalin, to start off with, well, there was a shortage in consumer goods continuing from the pre-war period due to the prioritisation of heavy industry in both the fourth and fifth five-year plans. We see harsh labour discipline for industrial workers, including 12-hour days, continuing wage differentials between higher and lower paid workers. We see very, very difficult conditions for the peasants. They had to endure these high quotas for procurement of grain, and also very low prices as collectivization was renewed. And there was restrictions on private plots, and there was a drought in 46, all which culminated in famine. There was increased persecution of national minorities, including internal deportation. There was continuation of the purges, and there was a rise in anti-Semitism. Terror continued to be the means used to control the population. So Stalin we see a great degree of continuity from the way that Stalin had operated both during and before the war. We then move on to the time in power of Melkhanov and Khrushchev. Now, Melkhanov eased some of the harsher aspects of Stalinistic rule. So, as I've already mentioned, he pushed the consumer industry rather than heavy industry and defense. And this was all part of his new course, which also included lowering taxation for peasants, increasing the prices paid by the state for grain, and increasing the size of private plots. Now, Khrushchev, as I'd already said, has initially opposed policies of Melkhanov, and he used this to undermine his rival in the power struggle. But Khrushchev adopted many of his ideas once he was in power. And this coincided from 1956 onwards with a policy of de-Stalinization. So there was a thaw in social policy, which brought about significant improvement to the standards of living for many Russians. And we can see here some of these positives that then happen under Khrushchev. So we've got an increase in the minimum wage in 1956 and again in 1960. And this was in order to reduce the wage gap between the highest and lowest paid workers. We see a 7-hour day introduced in 1960s. In 1960, with only 6 days on a Saturday. Holiday pay was introduced. The very harsh laws against absenteeism and changing jobs without permission were repealed. We see an expansion in social welfare with the expansion of the pension scheme for elderly, sick and disabled, particularly important for all those who've been permanently disabled by the war. In 1964, the scheme was extended to farmers on collective farms. Housing was a big area of expansion, particularly in 1957, the 40th anniversary of the revolution. Khrushchev started this major housing program, and the annual rate of housing construction doubled between 1956 and 1965. 108 million people were moved into new apartments. These new apartment blocks were fairly low quality prefabricated structures, but for many of the people moving into them, they were a significant improvement on the previous accommodation in communal blocks. There was also a significant increase in the number of doctors and hospital beds, and in education, secondary school leaving age was raised from 14 to 15, university fees were abolished, and the numbers entering higher education trebled. Access to higher education for children of workers and peasants was made far better and far easier. There wasn't, however, a complete thaw in social policy. Although peasants did not suffer as much as they had done under Stalin's rule, their standard of living did not hugely improve. Peasants still resented the control of the collective farms exerted over their lives, and in particular some of the policies we've seen, like getting the government trying to force them to sell their cows to the collective farm. Evidence of peasant apathy towards collective farms comes from the fact that their private plots, which made up only 3% of total land in the USSR, continued to contribute more than 30% of total agricultural production and half of the income of the peasants. For those peasants who had moved east as part of the Virgin Land Scheme, the initial success turned into a complete disaster as soil eroded and became infertile. Khrushchev also renewed his attack on religion after 1956. During the war, we'd seen tolerance of open acts of worship and church activities that helped raise morale. And that greater toleration had continued under Stalin after 1945. Khrushchev, however, wanted to rekindle the atheist spirit of Marx and Lenin in order to further push towards what he considered to be true socialism and communism in the USSR. Anti-religious propaganda was therefore strengthened between 1959 and 1964. About 75% of remaining churches and monasteries in the Soviet Union were closed down. Mosques and synagogues were targeted as well. Children were banned from church services in 1961, and it was made illegal for parents to teach their children about religion. Atheism was made compulsory on school curriculum, and pilgrimages were banned. Although Khrushchev did not persecute national minorities and ethnic minorities in the same way Stalin did, he didn't want the nationalities to gain greater powers of self-government. His aim seemed quite laudable in terms of he wanted all ethnic and national distinctions to disappear. However, he did very little to actually bring this about. And again, we see continuation of anti-Semitism as he resisted calls for the Jews to be allowed to run their own schools and prevented Jews from emigrating to the new state of Israel. Moving on to culture. So we see this period under Stalin known as Zadovshchina. And Stalin remained very keen to play a controlling role on cultural output in the Soviet Union and make sure it was in line with his views or interpretation of Marxist-Leninism. This kind of culture war becomes particularly important as the Cold War developed. So Stalin wanted to show that Soviet culture was superior to what he believed to be the decadent liberal culture of the West. Zandov was put in charge of cultural policy, and hence where this period gets its name from. But actually, really, Zandov was merely following Stalin's orders. They held concerns over the contact there had been between Soviet citizens and those in the West during the war, and that this might well have polluted the purity of Soviet culture. So Zandov moved to purify Soviet culture by getting rid of all Western bourgeois and cosmopolitan values. Hundreds of writers were expelled from the Writers' Union, meaning their work could not be published. This included Anna Akhmatova, the famous poet who Zandov denounced as half nun, half whore. Akhmatova was silent in the 1930s, had been reconciled with the regime during the war, celebrated for her contribution to the defense of Leningrad. However, now the emergency of war was over, her antipathy towards the regime was no longer going to be tolerated. During this period, Soviet composers were attacked if their work was considered to be influenced by Western values. Shostakovich's symphonies could no longer be performed, and musicians needed special licenses to listen to Stravinsky. Stalin continued to censor films and literature. He ordered Einstein's film about Ivan the Terrible to be changed so it was shown that it was necessary to be ruthless and that Ivan championed the national point of view. He safeguarded the country against the penetration of foreign influences. You get the impression that Stalin saw himself along similar lines to Ivan the Terrible. Anti-Semitism continued to be a strong feature. Many Jewish writers and critics were arrested. Remaining Jewish newspapers were closed down. And I mean, this bit is just mind-blowing. The histories of the war were written without even mentioning the Jews as victims of the Nazi atrocities. Western influences were almost eliminated. Foreign radio stations were jammed. Only a handful of approved foreign books were available in Russian translation. Hardly any Soviet writers or artists were allowed to go to the West. As we move to culture under Khrushchev, we see policies again in line with this idea of a thaw. Now, greater contact with the West was allowed, so foreign literature and broadcast restrictions on foreign literature and broadcast were lifted. Cultural and sports tours were arranged abroad with the ballet, the Moscow State Circus, Dynamo Kiev Football Club. Tourist was launched, enabling foreign visitors to come to the USSR. We see the World Festival of Youth organised in 1957, where 34,000 young people came from 131 countries. Band writers and artists were rehabilitated. So we see Anna Akhmatova's Requiem, which was originally written between 35 and 40, finally published in 63. And we see other writers allowed to publish again. The composer Shostakovich was permitted to compose and perform his music again. So this thought is important. Now, in my video on opposition, we also looked at quite a lot of this stuff, and it leads to cultural dissidence, and this actually causes some fairly significant problems for Khrushchev. So literature criticizing Stalin's regime was allowed. So Alexander Stanislavski's Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was personally ordered to be published by Khrushchev in '62. The book tells the story of one day in the life of a prisoner in a labor camp. The author himself had been imprisoned by the Stalinist regime for 9 years in '45. The book sold over 1 million copies in its first 6 months. In '62, we also see a poem by Yevtushenko, The Heirs of Stalin, in the state newspaper Pravda. The poem attacks Stalin and his followers, and in quite graphic language about the mausoleum, warned about the Stalin rising again and bringing back the terror of his regime. However, the cultural thought was not total. Khrushchev was prepared to tolerate work that criticised Stalin's regime, but he was not prepared to allow works that questioned the ideology of communism or the Soviet state, or directly criticised him. Further evidence that there wasn't a full thaw is shown by the fact that several writers and artists who pushed the boundaries too far continue to see their work banned. One of the most famous examples of this is the novel Dr. Zhivago. It was rejected because it felt it portrayed the revolution of the Soviet state in a negative way. The author managed to smuggle the manuscript to Italy, where it was published in '57. He won the Nobel Prize for it in '58. In the USSR, however, there was a campaign against him leaving. He was expelled from the Union of Soviet Writers, prevented from traveling abroad to collect his prize. His health suffered very badly due to the strain, and he died in 1960. Grossman's novel Life and Fate, about the USSR and the Second World War, was also prevented from being published. In '61, KGB officers entered his flat, confiscated the manuscript along with all other related materials. Grossman appeared to Khrushchev personally, but was told that his book would not be published for 200 to 300 years. It was actually published much sooner than that, first published in America in 1980 and then in the USSR in 1988. Khrushchev was personally scathing about modern art, which he deemed to be decadent and irrelevant to ordinary people. Now, again, with all this is also covered in my video on opposition to Khrushchev. So see that for more evidence on social dissidents and how Khrushchev reacts to them. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully this now puts you in a position where you've got all the videos you need to prepare for the exams in 2022, and I'm now almost at the point of having fully completed the playlist on Tsarist and Communist Russia, 1855 to 1964. So if you are studying that, then everything you should need should be on there. Just remind you to please like and share, and there's the thanks button, all different things on there as well. And there's loads more on the channel on different parts of history, and also a huge amount on A-level history if you're on A-level politics as well as A-level history if you're interested in that as well. Thank you very much for watching.